Hello and welcome to The Society with Barrister Fatma Shaheen at PTV World. They say that the decline of literature in any society is the decline of that very nation. Now, when we talk about literature, we need to understand the fact that, what potential does literature have in the development of any society? What influence, what impact does it have when it comes to changing the way people think? And this is exactly what we'll be talking about in our today's show. We'll be talking about literature and its relationship with the society at large. We'll be talking about the trends as they have evolved in the Pakistani society, and we'll also be talking about the challenges which not one, rather a lot of writers face in the society today and ways to overcome the same. All this and much more to follow on today's show, and to do that, let me introduce you to my today's panel. My first panelist for the show today is Miss Mina Malik, who is a writer alongside being a poet. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show.
Walaikum salam. Thank you for having me.
You're most welcome, Mina. And my second panelist for the show today is Hassan Kamal Wattu, who's a writer and he's also a columnist. Assalamu alaikum ji, and welcome to the show.
Walaikum salam. Thanks for having me.
You're most welcome. To get the conversation started with you, Mina, when we talk about literature, we understand the fact that, literature has that potential to give us new insight, new perspectives. But what is that most important perspective in your view as a writer, as an author yourself, which literature has the potential to offer to all of us, more so to young people in Pakistan?
I feel like literature and the arts, and I like to sort of lump them together because these are all different ways that we find creative expression takes many different forms. And I think that more than ever now, the arts are crucial for our, I think it's a little dramatic to say to save us, but I really feel it's true, because literature and the arts are a way of bridging gaps of connection between people. And I feel that especially now where there's so much intolerance and there's so much, well, to put it kindly, sensitivity about differing opinions, literature finds a way to have difficult conversations in a way that people can understand, in a way, sometimes in roundabout ways. Sometimes you can't say things directly, but the arts finds a way. You can do it through dance, you can do it through a poem, you can do it, a satirical play, for example, through laughter, through tragedy. And you can address these issues of human emotion that really connect all of us at the most instinctive level. And I think that generally we are moving towards motivations which have more to do with money and success, and a very limited idea of what success is. And we're moving away from the value of the art, seems to be dissipating for us.
So literature basically then has that potential to reiterate those values for us, if of course we use it in the proper manner. And I think you're very right there when you say that it has that potential, of course, to build tolerance in any society. But at the end of the day, I think it's something very subjective. The way anybody would look and read and understand a literary work would be something very relative, on which I'll come to. I think we must also talk about the declining, book culture in Pakistan, so to speak, more so from a youth perspective. So what reasons do you account for the same? Because generally we see, and correct me if I'm wrong, that, young people nowadays, they aren't that very interested in reading a book as they are interested in doing so many other things.
Absolutely. That's a question I hear a lot. It's a question I think is very important, and the underlying assumption within it is something I do take a bit of an issue with. Because see, with young people, we often hear a lot, and it's a bit of a simplistic argument in my opinion, that they're just not reading perhaps because they're somewhat more inept or more somehow inferior to the generation that preceded them. Therefore, they're not going out, they're not being active, they're just stuck in their phones all day. I find that argument a tiny bit simplistic, because what it ignores is that the actions and the habits of children of today and young people in my generation of today are different from those of the generation that preceded us, because the world we grew up in is very different from the world that preceded us. And the education system in itself has, in my view, failed to account for those changes. The education system has treated books as something to be rewarded and punished for. You're supposed to read a book, write a report, at the end of it you get a grade, you pass an exam. Now when people graduate high school, suddenly there's no longer any grades to be given, no exams testing that, and they don't have a reason to read anymore. That's, I think, the greatest tragedy, because we're deprived of all that books have to offer. I truly believe, and I feel this very strongly, young people my age and younger don't know what there is in books. James Baldwin said that you think that your pain and your suffering are unprecedented in human history, but then you read. So you'll find something to relate to, you'll find entertainment, you'll find value all in books if you just look towards them.
Right, your point is noted. And I think on which note you would want to add something to this, when we talk about, us not resorting, or the young people in Pakistan not resorting to book reading, so to speak, I think parents here have a very pivotal role to play. So how do you see this, especially from the parents' perspective?
Oh gosh, I have so many opinions on this. Well, you see, as a parent myself, I do, and as a huge bookworm myself, is that I think when we were growing up, and Hassan, you're right, is that our generation was different because we didn't have much. There was only 2 TV channels, and they'd only come on after 5, and all you could do was ride your bike or read a book, really. So we ended up doing a lot more of that. But I'm thinking back to the times when I used to teach, and I was teaching 8th and 9th graders. And that's the time when you choose your O-level subjects. And you would be astonished, Fatma, at how many parents would come up and ask me, because I taught English, about, well, what's the point of reading literature? What is my child going to do with literature? Because literature as a subject is sort of seen as something really easygoing, and all you just do is lie around and read storybooks all day. And that's clearly not the case. Any student of literature knows that you might be appear to be lying around reading a book, but you're actually doing serious intellectual work.
Of course.
And I think that, again, going back to what I was saying earlier about parents' anxieties about success and making your way in the world, somehow the arts is seen as something that girls can do as a hobby, or that boys who, you know, are shauqeen can do it. But it's not really seen as something that's lucrative.
But I think over a period of time, Mina, I think with people like yourself and, you know, so many other female authors that we do know, they have made it to the female literati in Pakistan. So do you not feel that, you know, over a period of time, one positive thing that has emerged in Pakistani literature is the fact that we see it to be more female inclusive per that way. Whether this inclusivity is something which has actually led to bringing about positive change, that is a separate question. But in terms of numbers, do we not see more females now?
I think, I feel like it's fairly even Stevens, even now. I think that the difference is in volume. So when I was growing up, you had Mohsin Hamid, and you had Kamila Shamsi, you had, you know, Nadeem Aslam, who technically is British Pakistani, so that was diaspora writing. But, you know, people who lived in the country and were writing, there were just a handful of people, Uzma Aslam Khan, and of course there were the poets. You know, we have Tawfiq Rafat and Adrian Hussain and Maki Qureshi, and of course the poetry has been, I think, galloping along a pace. And again, poetry in English. I can't really speak for the poetry in Urdu scene. I feel like we're still quite stuck in, you know, adoring Faiz Sahab, and of course, you know, it's wonderful work. But with fiction, I feel like it's really encouraging, it's really promising that in spite of anxious parents, and in spite of people wanting you to be a doctor or a lawyer, or an engineer, there are young people who have stuck to their guns.
Right, Mina, your point is noted. To which, Hassan, you wanted to add something.
I think these are such lovely points, and I'm reminded of that quote by Robin Williams in the film Dead Poets Society, that law, medicine, engineering, these are all noble pursuits necessary to sustain life. But art, romance, beauty, poetry, these are what make life worth living. So I see literature as the thing that makes life worth living. It's the reward in and of itself rather than something for which a reward should be sought.
And I think it's so important. You can have a love for the arts and literature and be a student of literature and also do something that is mainstream. And you have instances of so many people and so many writers who had day jobs and also wrote. Philip Larkin was a librarian and wrote poetry alongside. There are so many. Chekhov was a doctor.
So I think slowly and steadily over a period of time, we do see the typical stereotypes, the typical notions that we did attach with the, you know, literary industry, those changing. Hassan, I would want you to comment on this from a male perspective too. How do you compare, you know, the portrayal of different characters that we do see in Pakistani literature, especially when you compare the way the males are portrayed to the way the females are portrayed, because we do have a lot of reservations being raised on the way females more so are being portrayed.
I would focus more on the things that are foundational, that affect both of them, and therefore it would benefit both of those subgroups to address those individually. When I was growing up, in my youth, I would read so many authors that Mina had rightly mentioned earlier, including some other names. Muhammad Hanif was my favorite author growing up, Danial Moinuddin, a lot of wonderful Pakistani writers in whom I found voice, in whom I found relatability. And sadly now I just don't see that, and I wonder, it's not that the writers are any worse or that the writing standard has declined, I would never say that, but I think that the opportunities available to them, the means to push them up have suddenly disappeared as a result of our bad decisions.
But coming to you, Mina, I think we must also talk about, you know, not only the level of inclusivity that we must give to women and also to other, you know, vulnerable segments in the society, especially when it comes to their reflection in Pakistani literature, but the kind of narrative that is being set by them. Now, a criticism that we generally see in the Pakistani drama industry is that, you know, women are given screen space, but they are not, you know, portrayed in a very strong, progressive light. So do you feel that this is something which is equally applicable when we come to the, you know, Pakistani literary industry?
You know, I think that's a really interesting question because television is governed by a lot of other constraints, including ratings and producers' opinions, and screenwriters are producing certain things, and everybody seems to have a very particular idea of what audiences want. I personally feel that we really underestimate our audiences. I think that our consumption is actually, people are extremely intelligent and discerning and are able to appreciate something different when it's presented to them. I think that there is more freedom and there's more space in the literary world, at least, because, and also slightly because of what Hassan was talking about earlier, is that the publishing industry is still in its infancy in Pakistan. And because we don't have the kind of access we used to have to international publishing houses as we did previously, ironically, there's a certain amount of freedom for writers to go about their art however way they want. So I think that that's really interesting. I think that, you know, writers like Shandana Minhas, who wrote Rafina, which is a lovely novella about a salon girl. Meera Sethi's book of stories has some wonderfully
and I think
drawn
most of
women.
the issues that she has touched are those issues which we usually don't talk about, you know, generically in the normal course of lives. When we talk about, you know, literature having that impact or having that influence, when we, you know, have to talk about very important conversations, when we have to take a very important, you know, socially motivated causes, be it mental health, be it, you know, maybe transgender rights, be it divorce for that matter, do you feel that we have given ample space to the same?
Right. I think that we failed to cater to books to begin with. Now, when you get books, the first thing is to have good books. When a piece of art is good, when it appeals to people, when it's read, that's what matters. I could write the most progressive book in the world about every social issue on the planet, but it doesn't matter if nobody's going to read it. So something that's good, that's a contribution to the literary scene of a country and progresses, moves it forward. I think that's what really works, and that's what's worked on an international scale in the past. That's what impacted me when I was growing up and I read books. And to expand on Mina's points earlier, I find that the reason that books are such an underappreciated art form in this country and a means of consuming art in this country is that for a place like Pakistan, if you even look towards films and television, they're all bound by so many constraints. Constraints of budget, constraints of logistics, constraints of pragmatism. Whereas in a book, there's nothing, there's no constraint but the author's imagination.
And this is a very valid point that you have raised. I think we must also talk about, you know, when we talk about social issues, when we talk about different issues which we otherwise don't talk about, you know, like one being dissolution of marriage, which I just mentioned, then of course the taboo issue of mental health, maybe transgender rights, maybe minority rights too. Do you feel as an author, as a writer yourself, as a poet too, that these issues get ample space in Pakistan's literary industry?
I feel like there is, again, there's some really interesting work out there. I also feel that it's fairly fraught because I do feel that whilst I do have hopes, I have optimistic hopes of general readership, I also find that our readership can be quite vicious, and that social media hasn't helped that at all. People will kind of tear books to shreds on Goodreads and on Twitter and not engage with it in a sort of with depth, which is disappointing, I'm sure, for a lot of writers. I also feel that too often there is a great pressure on creatives to uphold a sort of social morality in their work, and sometimes I feel like art should just be art. And sometimes one will approach it with a certain politics and with a certain social motivation, I'm sure. And I'm sure you can read those themes into it because of course nobody is writing in a vacuum. We're all products of our society, and those things will naturally find their way into anybody's creative work. But sometimes a story is just a story also.
So I think of course we should look at this in a very multi-dimensional kind of a way. So considering that you also write poetry, you know, what is that tilt that you have? Is it more, you know, social issue based? Is it more relying on the cultural dimension?
I think that my poetry comes from a very personal place. Most of the time. Again, I don't want to kind of tread that line because a lot of times people tend to conflate an author or writer with their work, and there's a gap there. So you can be inhabiting a character, you can be writing about things that you don't have a personal experience with, but again, that's the beauty of fiction, or that's the beauty of the imagination. But I do feel that my fiction, I think, is more it has a more critical undertone. The novel that I'm working on, for example, is a very conscious homage to Khatija Mastoor's work, for example.
Right.
So it's very much in my mind the politics of space that women inhabit in South Asian society. You know, the idea of the zenana and the stories that emerge from the center,
Right.
rippling outwards. So
Right.
things like that. So yeah.
Right, Meena. But coming to us, and I think we must also talk about, you know, generally the challenges that young writers like yourself do come across when they are writing. So what are the issues that you come across, and what will your recommendations be that how can you address the same? Because I was reading this article of yours and I quote, you very clearly say that, you know, don't throw the writers, the poets, the dreamers to the wolves. So, you know, where does this all come about?
Right, so that article in itself, it was titled You're Among Friends, which was inspired by a bookstore that I walked into in London while I was at university there, and it was so reassuring that at time, exactly. So even when things were so difficult, when you're missing home, you can walk into that bookstore, you can find books by authors from home, authors that you've read so much that they feel like old friends. You see a book by Danial Moinuddin, Muhammad Hanif, Mohsin Hamid, and suddenly it can just dive you back into old memories and back into your home in Lahore. And I found that it was bittersweet that in that foreign land I could find that feeling, but when I got back, the rate at which new writers were coming had drastically gone down to what was previously a flow of new writers was now a bare trickle at best. And I was confused as to what the reasons for that might be. And when I looked into it, I found that it's a two-pronged intersection between the people that matter, not giving them that representation, not giving them that uplifting that they deserve, and also a lack of opportunities, a mix of various factors, including cut downs in book trade, because as we know, publishing is variously dependent on international trade.
And I think COVID-19 particularly has also impacted, you know, the Pakistani literary industry, both in terms of, you know, writers getting a chance to sit down and write about things that they didn't get a chance to write otherwise, more so in the lockdowns. Also, you know, bookstores on which we've seen a mixed response. There have been bookstores which have been closed down, and there have also been bookstores who've said that the sales have actually gone up during the pandemic.
Right. I'm sure a very interesting and nuanced analysis of the impact of COVID on Pakistan's literary and publishing scene could be made. That we've seen on international scales where writing is celebrated as opposed to ignored, when authentic voices are incentivized rather than pushed down. If I look towards more established writers like Minna for hope and optimism, and I'd love to hear from her how she sees the
hope
horizon.
and optimism. I think these are things that you must tell him, but before that you must tell us also that when we talk about the challenges that, you know, people face, more so when females face, because there is this general conception in the literature industry that it's very male dominated. So tell us that, you know, being such an accomplished writer, author, and of course a poet yourself, do you feel that this is true?
Well, from the get-go, the fact that when we refer to women's writing, we say women's writing and we don't just say writing.
Right.
Really does show where where to begin, because I think traditionally literature has been dominated by men, and even now when we think of serious literature, we always think of very masculine tropes. So we're thinking about novels that deal with war and politics and bombs exploding, and we take those books seriously. And then when we look at women's writing, and I'm putting it in quotes now because we tend to think of chick lit, and we tend to think of you know, again, zenani kahanis. But the fact is that women writing about women and writing about female concerns is just as important as writing about anything else.
Right.
And I feel like that shift is something that needs to be done in a really mindful way.
And I think one more important thing when we talk about this, you know, in terms of the issues that women do face, there have been women publishers out there which say that there is a gender disparity, especially when it comes to publishing of books, especially when it comes to marketing your book, so to speak. So when we talk about, I think, all these issues, we need to consider this in a broader perspective. But coming to you, I would want you to, you know, tell us more about this literary magazine which you are working on, and it is something in the pipeline that, you know, how do you feel, how do you actually aim that it is something that will actually promote literary development?
Yeah. So the exciting thing, I think, about being in the arts in Pakistan is that there are a lot of gaps that one can address. And for example, this renaissance of publishing that has happened, there is an increasing space now being made for young writers to find a platform for their work, to put out their graphic novel, to put out their poetry, to put out their novels, to put out their coffee table books. And there's so many ideas, and there's so many really enthusiastic and really talented people out there who have wonderful things to say but just didn't have a platform.
Right.
So I feel like that's where the hope or the optimism comes in, is that it's struggling and it still needs a lot of help and it needs a lot of support. But we're getting there, we're itching along. I think this is one great thing about Pakistanis, that we refuse to give up.
So I think by that definition, I think young writers need to keep on striving till the time they get a
Or
proper
all writers.
framework.
All writers, full stop.
But I think I
I
think he would be speaking more on behalf of young writers like himself. So,
yes,
and I think
but at this point, and again coming back to kind of difficulties, like I don't consider myself a young writer. I'm sort of like a middle-aged writer now. But the point is that I think that with writing, and especially for women, it's seen as something you can do at home with the kids and the house, and you can just sort of do it like a little thing on the side. But it's incredibly difficult to do it. And I think that for women especially, I think men are better able to take charge of their ambition and to carve space for them, because society is set up that way. That we all, men's work is privileged and taken seriously no matter what they're doing. So even male writers who will shut themselves up in their study and no one will knock on the door. No one's going to ask them, okay, you know, we need to get some eggs and bread, can you give me some money? No one will ask them. But they ask me when I'm in my study with the door closed, right? So I think this is one thing I would really like to say on this platform is that you must guard your time ferociously and take your own work so seriously, because nobody else is going to do it for you.
Of course, you have to create that space for you yourself.
And not just create it,
as a woman, of course, you have to sustain it too.
And even if it's an hour in the day, if it's half an hour, I think there's no set way to do anything. There's no process, there's no one size fits all process.
Right.
It's only what works for you, but to keep going, to keep going at it. I think my career has started very late in my life. Which is also fine. You know, there's a time for it.
No, but then you also can't deny the fact, Meena, that you do have that support from your family, including your husband, because of course you have made a name for yourself. You are respected in your own right, and it wouldn't have been possible if you hadn't had that family support. And I think in this regard, coming back to the issue that you were earlier raising as well, that when we talk about, you know, having a proper framework, when we talk about perhaps having a proper policy, so to speak, what would your recommendations be in this regard? That, you know, what are the issues that we 1, 2, 3 need to work on if we want to properly boost the Pakistan's literary industry?
Right. For that, I'm reminded of a book recommended to me by a mentor of mine. That was by Joe Moran, First You Write a Sentence. And that, I believe, it just captures the heart of advice about writing. If you start to overthink it, if you start to wonder about all of these infinite and limitless nuances and points to consider and ponder over, you're not really going to get anywhere. And I found that helped me. My journey as a writer was that at the age of 14, I would send emails to every editor I could find and get badly rejected by all of them, and still just persist. And then as I grew older, I managed to realize, okay, somebody's going to publish my letter to the editors.
I think you were lucky that way, Hassan, that you got that chance, which others might not get. But of course, you have to be perseverant in order to be successful. But when we talk about the system being enabling that way, how do you feel can we improve it so as to, you know, encourage more people like yourself to write?
Every field you go through, it doesn't matter, it's not just about writing in law, medicine, whichever field you go to, there's going to be challenges. You just need to push against the wind. The path is steep, but you need to go anyways. I found that I didn't use any connections in the media. I didn't know anyone in the media. I simply just found an email. I wrote to some paper and then I wrote to another. And then I found that in writing very badly at the beginning, because when you're 14 years old writing to a paper, you're not writing some Shakespearean novels in there. So as I did that, I think people tell me, now my audience will be the judge of that, but I think it got better, and now I'm grateful to be writing for Pakistan's most widely read newspaper. I think that's a blessing, and the tangible impact that one gets out of it, I enjoy it more than perhaps any other project I've worked on, because when I write that and when I get comments from all over Pakistan, that's a feeling that one cannot recreate.
Right, Hassan, your point is noted, on which I'll come to you, Meena, and coming towards the conclusion of the show. You know, we must also talk about the very important role of mentor and mentees, and something which we generally see lacking in the literary industry. So how can we work on that so as to build the industry further?
You know, I think that we are at such a promising juncture with regards to mentorship, because again, it's a sort of two-edged sword. I think that a lot of upcoming writers who have found a niche and are doing well, like Awais Khan, for example, who runs the Writing Institute, or Fatma Bhutto, who works with South Asia Speaks, which is a wonderful mentoring fellowship for South Asian writers, are really progressive, and a lot of different other writers as well, are really interactive and progressive and want to help, and are so good about reaching out and sharing resources and really building community. Usman Malik is on the Salam Award board, for example, and you know, the Zinat Haroon Prize. So there are so many people who are coming together to build literary community, to give feedback, to be inclusive, and social media has had such a wonderful role here. I think that writers now have access and direct access to a lot of writers who are generous with their time and really want to help. And I think that that is a massive change from when I was younger. And you couldn't really go, it wasn't like you couldn't go and like just ask people like, how do you get an agent? Or, you know, sort of, how does one find a publisher? What's the difference? You know, things like that, that now you have answers to these questions. And it's so exciting. And I really encourage people watching this to do their homework. So when I started out at the same newspaper that Hassan writes for, it was an internship. And the editor there was so wonderful, and he gave me my first byline. The most exciting part about the creative industry or the literary sort of scene in Pakistan right now is that there are lots of gaps to be filled. And whilst we have been talking about how crippled the publishing industry is, I think this is where like the hope and optimism comes in, is that for every difficulty that we have, we also have a small band of publishers, a lot of them are women, who are really pushing back and putting out all these really promising books. So we have poetry, we have graphic novels, we have coffee table books. There are so many voices out there who need a platform, and these publishing houses are really pushing back as hard as they can. There's just a handful, but they're at it, and they should be given all the support that we can possibly muster, both as readers and structurally. I think that the second gap also, and this is exciting, is because I'm working on a project to address it, is taking our young people seriously. And we've been talking about young people a lot, but there's a big gap here when we're looking at children's literature and we're looking at literature for young adults. And this is where mentorship is also so important, where you catch them at the right age.
This is where inclusivity is also very important.
And you catch them at the right age with the right kinds of ideas and the right kinds of, you know, sort of suggestions for them, because they're growing minds. They're supple, they're curious, and that's the age to really get them. And if we can put out engaging content that is, you know, things that will open up their minds to all kinds of different ideas. And this is how we start building tolerant societies. This is how we start building societies that are able to think for themselves and to be able to give each other space for differing opinions. And that's why literature is so important.
You will generally agree with me on this too, because in the legal profession as well, we do see that there is this element which is lacking. We don't have those typical mentor-mentee relationships, at least not in abundance. So I think this is something which generally applies to other professions too, so to speak.
Young people being taken seriously can change everything for them.
Of course, of course. There's no two ways about that. But coming to you, Hassan, coming towards the conclusion of the show, what would your concluding comment be in this regard? More so when we talk about, you know, the role of literature as it does stand in Pakistan's modern society, and of course, you know, given the contours that we do live in today, considering that, you know, it's such a technology-driven world.
Right. So I think in Pakistan and across the world right now, the dilemma that we face is that we're overwhelmed with so many options, as opposed to previous generations. We've got you've got entertainment at your fingertips at all times. You've got TikTok, you've got Instagram, Snapchat. All of that is constantly pouring information onto you, and it's so easy to get both desensitized and overwhelmed at the same time. But what we forget is, despite it all, the unique contribution and value that literature has to offer, the unique relatability in it. To this day, Pakistani cinema is unable to compete with Hollywood because we don't have the budget, we don't have the capabilities, we don't have the lack of censorship, we don't have the freedom of media to say what we want, but a book will have every single thing. A Pakistani book can be better and more relatable and more unique to your life. You will be reading it and you will recognize yourself, recognize characters that could be your neighbors, your relatives in it. And that is something which to me, I found uniquely valuable. It helped me grow as a person. It made me the person who I am today. And I owe Pakistani writers, the ones who I read as a child, that much, that they made me a huge part of what I am. And I hope that we can contribute, at least to some small extent, through our writings into something that is bigger than ourselves.
You must, of course, and I think this was the very purpose because of which we had this show, that, you know, we all consider this entire debate of literature, the way it has evolved in the context of the society, so to speak. On which note, I would like to conclude today's show. Thank you so much, Meena, and thank you so much, Hassan, for being here with us today. Well, to conclude today's show, we generally spoke about the way Pakistan's literary industry has evolved over a period of time. We also spoke about the fact that, you know, we generally see this very interesting, rather very welcoming trend where a lot of taboo topics which were otherwise not picked up by the industry before, they are actually now made part of discourse. They are made part of very important conversations. This is definitely a momentum which must definitely continue, because we need to understand the fact that when it comes to literature, the challenge is just not in writing. The challenge comes in giving that writing a cause, in giving that writing a purpose, and this is something that we all need to work on. Thank you for watching The Society. Until next time, take care and Allah Hafiz.